The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has said he's hopeful that Hamas will accept what he has described as an extraordinarily generous Gaza ceasefire offer from Israel. We've been hearing in the last few minutes the proposed ceasefire would be for 40 days. Mr. Blinken, who's attending talks with his regional counterparts in Saudi Arabia, was speaking as a delegation from Hamas attended parallel ceasefire negotiations in Cairo. After weeks of impasse, Hamas is reported to have no major issues with a revised plan approved by Israel. It's said to include new wording on a cessation of hostilities. Mr. Blinken reaffirmed US opposition to a planned Israeli offensive on Rafah City, meanwhile, saying he's seen no plan that protects civilians there. 20 people died in the latest Israeli airstrikes overnight.
In this moment, the only thing standing between the people of Gaza and a ceasefire is Hamas. They have to decide, and they have to decide quickly. So we're looking to that, and I'm hopeful that they will make the right decision, and we can have a fundamental change in the dynamic.
The UK's Foreign Secretary, meanwhile, has given more detail on the ceasefire deal on the table.
It does seem to me there is now, let's be frank, a pretty generous offer of, sustained 40-day ceasefire, the release of potentially thousands of Palestinian prisoners in return for the release of these hostages who've now been in captivity for over 200 days. So I hope Hamas do take this deal, and frankly all the pressure in the world and all the eyes of the world should be on them today, saying take that deal. It will bring about this stop in the fighting that we all want to see so badly.
And let's go live now to Jerusalem and our security correspondent, Frank Gardner. Frank, hello to you. It certainly is a critical moment with a real sense of momentum, it seems.
There really is. I mean, although it's right at the end of Pasach here, of Passover, there is a feeling that there could be a real breakthrough here because both sides, Hamas and Israel, they've made concessions, there's no question about it. So Hamas had originally insisted on an end to the war, and Israel is not agreeing to that, but it is agreeing to withdraw its some of its forces and to allow the passage of the return of Palestinians who are basically kettled right into the south in Rafah to their homes in the north of Gaza, and that's been a really key demand. They also dropped their insistence that it has to be at least 40 hostages. The figure that's being talked around is a bit lower than that, around 33. So there is some give here because there is enormous pressure on both sides, from the Qataris, from the Egyptians, from the Americans, from the French, to get this deal through. And remember that behind the scenes here, the cabinet, the war cabinet in this country, Israel, is divided. You've got those who don't want to see any deal at all to Hamas. They want to see the Egyptians, they want to see the Israeli military go in hard, smash their way into Rafah and eliminate the last remaining few battalions of Hamas, the people that carried out the atrocities of October the 7th. But the US has made it very clear they are opposed to any operation in Rafah as it stands at the moment because they don't think that Israel is capable of protecting all those civilians that are currently sheltering them.
So we've been hearing about this phrase, sustainable calm, Frank, and I wonder, does potentially a 40-day ceasefire represent that or something more?
Well, look, what everybody's hoping for is to be able to bring an end to this thing altogether. What nobody outside this country wants is to see this truce end and for the whole thing to begin all over again. Now, there are people, certainly in the Israeli military and intelligence and security establishment, who say, look, we've got unfinished business in Gaza. Yahya Sinwar, the architect of the October the 7th attacks, and others are still at large, probably in the tunnels underneath Rafah. If we don't go into Rafah, then it's unfinished business and it'll just pop up like a hydra's head and we'll face the same threats all over again. But the sheer humanitarian, the depth and the extent of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, being pushed to the brink of famine, has really galvanized the international community to try and end the hostilities, or at least bring a temporary pause to them and some respite. And there is great progress on the humanitarian front. Much more aid is getting into Gaza. This great big pontoon is being built in central Gaza that's going to reach out in like a kind of finger out into the eastern Mediterranean Sea for offloading tons of aid. More crossing points are opening, more trucks are getting in. So, but that's not, of course, that's just a band-aid. That's just a sticking plaster for the greater problems, which are the Palestinians still don't have a state. And there is no sign from this Israeli government that it wants to ever depart or to give them a kind of route map to that end state.
OK, Frank, thank you very much. Frank Gardner there, our security correspondent in Jerusalem. And let's get some more analysis on this story now, this developing story, because joining us is Mark Kimmett, former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for the Middle East and a former Brigadier General. Thank you very much for your time today. And what's your reading of this intensive diplomatic activity, first of all?
Well, I think there is some progress being made. Otherwise, Secretary Blinken would not be appearing at these conferences. He's putting his personal reputation on the line that somehow he has brokered a deal between Israel and Egypt and Qatar. So I think we're just going to have to see. As your previous correspondent said, there seems to be some enthusiasm. But if it's only 40 or less hostages, I think we've still got a long way to go before a true and lasting ceasefire will be in place.
Yeah, and can whatever is being talked about stop an offensive on Rafah? We heard Secretary Blinken say that, he's seen no evidence yet of solid plans to protect civilians there in Rafah.
Well, again, I don't think it will stop the war. I think it will delay the attack, the assault into Rafah. As you remember, some time ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu said before he conducted an operation into Rafah, there would be sufficient housing, food, water, medicine for the refugees that would come out of Rafah. But as Secretary Blinken said, there's no evidence that that has been completed yet.
So a long way from the sort of irreversible pathway to a two-state solution that the Jordanian Prime Minister has been talking about.
I think there's an irreversible. I don't think we even have a path to the end of this war, much less a two-state solution.
OK, so what's next then? Some sort of temporary cessation, not the sustainable calm that's been mentioned?
No, I think you're exactly right. I think this will be a pause. This will not be a secession. It's clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu's objectives have not changed: the destruction of Hamas, the destruction of the infrastructure, and the return of the hostages. This may be a milestone, but there are a lot of milestones that need to be accomplished: the return of the hostages, the defeat of Hamas. And unless Prime Minister Netanyahu steps down, those will remain his war aims.
And just finally and briefly, you think the idea of senior Hamas figures and those responsible for October the 7th leaving Gaza, do you think that's likely?
Horizontally, certainly not vertically.
Thank you very much for your thoughts today. Mark Kimmett, former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for the Middle East.
Thank you.